The global economy runs on the US dollar not because countries admire America, but because the system leaves them few realistic alternatives. Since the end of World War II, the dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency, meaning governments, banks, and corporations rely on it to trade, borrow, save, and stabilize their economies. Oil commodities, shipping insurance, international loans, and emergency reserves are largely priced or settled in dollars, creating deep financial plumbing that cannot be replaced quickly without disruption. When countries earn dollars through exports, they often reinvest them into US Treasury bonds, reinforcing the system even further. Over decades, this cycle made the dollar central through convenience, trust, and scale rather than constant force. Other currencies exist, but none combine liquidity, legal predictability, and global acceptance at the same level. Using the dollar reduces transaction costs, limits currency risk, and simplifies cross-border trade for businesses worldwide. Even geopolitical rivals depend on it because opting out would raise costs for their own firms, consumers, and governments. Efforts to bypass the dollar usually remain regional, limited, or symbolic rather than structural. Economists describe this dependence as a trap because leaving is expensive while staying feels unavoidable. The system also gives the United States cheaper borrowing and significant financial influence, yet it depends on maintaining deep, stable markets to function. This foundation matters because debates around sanctions, de-dollarization, and global power all rest on it. Without understanding this base, modern financial conflicts appear chaotic rather than deliberate. The dollar quietly shapes crises, alliances, bailouts, trade rules, currency swings, and policy responses across the globe, ensuring its dominance persists even as criticism grows and confidence occasionally wavers over time. This dominance did not happen naturally. It was cemented by a specific historical shift that reshaped global power forever. To understand why the dollar became unavoidable, you have to go back to the final years of World War II, when much of the global economy lay physically destroyed. Europe and Asia faced shattered factories, empty treasuries, and collapsed currencies, while the United States emerged largely intact, with strong industry, gold reserves, and political leverage. In 1944, Allied nations met at Bretton Woods to rebuild global finance and avoid the chaos that followed World War I. The agreement tied currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, effectively placing the United States at the center of the system. This was not presented as domination, but as stability, because America could supply liquidity, credit, and security when others could not. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created to manage this order using the dollar as the primary unit. Over time, trade contracts, reserves, and debt were structured around this framework, making alternatives increasingly impractical. When the gold link was broken in the early 1970s, the system did not collapse because habits, infrastructure, and trust had already formed. Oil-producing nations continued pricing energy in dollars, while financial markets deepened around US assets. Each crisis reinforced reliance because the dollar offered safety during uncertainty. What began as a post-war solution hardened into a permanent architecture. Countries adjusted policies to fit the system rather than replace it. This historical momentum matters because once systems scale globally, they resist reversal regardless of fairness. The dollar's dominance is therefore less about American intent and more about path dependence, where early advantages compound across decades. Understanding this origin reveals why breaking away now would require rebuilding global finance from scratch with enormous risk and cost. Even countries that openly criticize American power continue using the dollar because global trade rewards coordination more than independence. When most buyers, sellers, insurers, and lenders operate in one currency, switching alone creates friction, costs, and risk. Companies hedging exchange rates face higher fees, unpredictable pricing, and thinner markets outside the dollar. Central banks therefore hold dollars to defend their currencies during shocks and to reassure investors. Financial markets reinforce this behavior because US Treasury bonds are considered among the most liquid and widely accepted assets available. During crises, investors rush into dollars, not because they trust US politics, but because everyone else does the same. This network effect means the dollar strengthens precisely when alternatives are needed most. Attempts to promote other currencies such as the euro or renminbi run into structural limits. The euro lacks unified fiscal authority, while China maintains capital controls that restrict free movement. Regional trade in local currencies exists, but remains narrow compared to global flows. Payment systems, clearinghouses, and legal contracts are already dollar-centered, making transition costly. Sanctions further complicate exit by reminding countries how dependent they are on dollar-based systems. Ironically, this pressure often increases dollar demand rather than reducing it because safety becomes scarce. Over time, dependence deepens quietly through routine decisions rather than dramatic choices. No single country can abandon the dollar without coordinating globally, which creates a collective action problem. Everyone waits for others to move first while continuing to rely on the same system. This reality explains why de-dollarization headlines rarely translate into measurable change and why dominance persists through inertia more than force. This inertia shapes policy debates, market expectations, and long-term planning across governments, businesses, and institutions. What appears as choice is actually coordination, locking the system tighter each year. The dollar system is reinforced not only by trade, but by global debt, which quietly binds governments and corporations to US financial markets. A large share of international borrowing is denominated in dollars because lenders prefer its stability and deep liquidity. For borrowers, this creates a hidden vulnerability because revenues are often earned in local currencies, while repayments are owed in dollars. When the dollar strengthens debt, burdens rise instantly, even if domestic conditions have not changed. This dynamic has shaped repeated crises across Latin America, Asia, and emerging markets over decades. To manage this risk, countries accumulate dollar reserves, which further increases demand for the currency. Global banks also prefer dollar lending because it can be easily hedge-traded and enforced under established legal systems. This makes alternative currency lending more expensive and less accessible. Over time, infrastructure develops around what is cheapest and safest, reinforcing the same choice repeatedly. Multinational corporations follow similar logic by pricing contracts and holding cash in dollars to avoid uncertainty. Even international institutions assess risk through dollar benchmarks. Once debt markets scale globally, changing the base currency becomes extremely disruptive because contracts cannot be rewritten without losses. This gives the dollar extraordinary staying power even without political pressure. Financial dependence becomes normalized through balance sheets rather than ideology. Countries seeking autonomy often discover that exiting dollar debt would require austerity capital controls or financial isolation. These costs make gradual adaptation more appealing than radical change. As a result, the system perpetuates itself quietly through incentives rather than enforcement. Understanding this debt linkage explains why monetary shifts are slow and why talk of alternatives often stalls once financial realities appear. The dollar is embedded not just in trade, but in obligations stretching decades into the future across public and private sectors worldwide. This debt-based dependence means even small policy shocks can ripple globally with outsized consequences. The dollar trap also shapes global politics because financial power translates into diplomatic leverage in subtle but effective ways. Countries that rely on dollar markets must consider access to payment systems, banks, and clearing networks when making foreign policy decisions. This does not mean obedience, but it does create caution, especially during conflicts or sanctions disputes. When access to dollar liquidity tightens trade, slows investment falls, and domestic stability can weaken quickly. Because most international settlements pass through US-linked systems, pressure can be applied without military force. This reality encourages compliance even among states seeking strategic independence. Over time, governments design policies to avoid financial retaliation rather than confront it directly. This influence is amplified by institutions, rating agencies, and investors who react immediately to dollar-related signals. A downgrade, capital flight, or funding freeze can cause serious damage within weeks. As a result, political autonomy becomes constrained by financial exposure. This does not require conspiracy, it follows incentives. Policymakers respond to risks that markets punish most aggressively. Since those risks are priced in dollars, the system reinforces itself. Even when alternative alliances form, they still operate inside a dollar-dominated environment. The trap therefore operates psychologically as well as structurally shaping expectations, behavior, and strategy. Countries plan around dollar reactions long before crises appear. This explains why global power often looks uneven even without direct intervention. Financial centrality becomes influenced by default. The more integrated the system grows, the harder it becomes to separate economics from politics. Understanding this dimension reveals why monetary dominance affects sovereignty, trust, and global decision-making far beyond exchange rates alone. These constraints shape long-term choices, budgets, alliances, reforms, elections, expectations, narratives, institutions, behaviors, incentives, priorities, outcomes worldwide across modern interconnected economies. Financial power quietly becomes political gravity, pulling everyone inward today. The persistence of the dollar system also depends on trust in American financial institutions, rather than trust in American politics. Global investors differentiate between political noise and the underlying legal and market framework that governs US assets. Courts enforce contracts predictably, property rights are clear, and capital can move freely in and out without sudden restrictions. These characteristics matter more to long-term investors than short-term political swings. During uncertainty, money prioritizes rule stability over ideology. This is why capital often flows into US markets, even when domestic debates appear chaotic. The depth of US financial markets allows large volumes to move without disrupting prices, which is critical for central banks, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds. No other country currently offers markets of comparable size, transparency, and accessibility simultaneously. Efforts to replicate this environment face trade-offs between control and openness. Countries that tightly manage capital reduce risk internally but lose external trust. Countries that liberalize fully expose themselves to volatility. The United States absorbed this volatility over decades, building shock tolerance others lack. This historical accumulation cannot be copied quickly. It required scale crises and repeated adaptation. As a result, alternatives struggle not because they are inferior in theory, but because they lack proven resilience under stress. Trust compounds slowly, but disappears quickly. The dollar benefits from a long record of surviving wars, recessions, inflation, and financial crashes without default. That record matters more than current headlines. Investors behave conservatively when systems are complex, choosing familiarity over experimentation. This conservatism anchors the dollar system further. Each crisis reinforces habits rather than breaks them. The structure persists, not through coercion, but through accumulated confidence built across generations. Understanding this explains why even strategic rivals hold dollar assets despite political tension. They prioritize systemic reliability over symbolic independence because financial survival depends on it. This accumulated trust is the invisible force keeping the dollar at the center. Because the dollar system is so deeply embedded, any serious attempt to escape it carries real economic penalties that few governments are willing to absorb. Shifting away would require rewriting trade contracts, restructuring debt reserves and payment systems, and convincing markets to accept higher uncertainty. These transitions raise borrowing costs immediately, which can slow growth, trigger inflation, or weaken currencies. For developing economies, the risks are even greater because access to dollar liquidity often determines stability during crises. Losing that access can lead to capital flight shortages and social unrest. Even large economies face trade-offs because businesses prefer predictable systems over experimental ones. If a government pushes too aggressively, companies may relocate operations to safer financial environments. This creates political resistance at home because voters feel the pain long before benefits appear. As a result, de-dollarization tends to remain rhetorical rather than practical. Gradual diversification happens quietly, while core reliance stays intact. Central banks may add other currencies, but rarely reduce dollar holdings dramatically. Trade agreements may mention alternatives, but settlement often returns to dollars for convenience. The system discourages sudden moves by making costs front-loaded and gains distant. This asymmetry locks behavior in place. Governments operate within constraints, not ideals. Even when leaders promise monetary independence, structural dependence limits options. Over time, pragmatism replaces ambition. The dollar trap therefore persists, not because alternatives are impossible, but because coordination failure makes them unattractive. No country wants to move first and bear the adjustment costs alone. Collective change requires trust alignment and patience across rivals with competing interests. That level of coordination is rare. Until it emerges, the safest choice remains staying inside the system while criticizing it publicly. This contradiction defines modern global finance and explains why the dollar remains dominant despite constant challenges. Stability keeps winning over disruption, even when the system feels unfair. Technology is often presented as the force that will finally weaken the dollar system, but in practice, it has reinforced existing power structures more than it has disrupted them. Digital payments, faster settlement systems, and financial innovation still rely on underlying currencies and legal frameworks. Most global financial technology platforms clear through dollar-linked banks because liquidity and trust remain concentrated there. Even emerging alternatives like digital currencies, stablecoins, or blockchain-based settlements are frequently pegged to the dollar rather than replacing it. This reveals a key truth. Innovation does not automatically change incentives, it often amplifies them. Businesses adopt new tools to reduce friction, not to increase risk. If a system already works reliably, technology tends to optimize around it. Central bank digital currencies are discussed widely, yet most designs focus on domestic efficiency rather than global replacement. Cross-border usage still requires trust, coordination, and openness, which remain limited. Meanwhile, private actors choose dollars because counterparties accept them universally. Payment speed matters less than settlement certainty. During stress tests, markets still demand dollar liquidity above all else. Even when sanctions push experimentation, the scale remains small relative to global flows. Technology lowers barriers, but does not remove the need for shared standards. The dollar already occupies that role. Changing it would require not just new tools, but new consensus governance and enforcement mechanisms. Those develop slowly and unevenly. As a result, technological optimism often underestimates institutional inertia. Systems evolve incrementally, not explosively. The dollar adapts, absorbing innovation while maintaining dominance. This adaptability is one reason predictions of collapse repeatedly fail. Financial power today is less about format and more about network depth. Technology connects nodes but does not replace the network itself. Understanding this helps explain why disruption headlines rarely translate into systemic change. Innovation reshapes the surface while the foundation stays largely intact. The dollar remains central because it aligns with how global finance actually operates, rather than how people hope it might transform. Change keeps circling the system instead of breaking through it. Geopolitical shifts are often cited as the moment that will finally end dollar dominance, but history shows shocks usually strengthen it instead. Wars, trade conflicts, and sanctions increase uncertainty, which drives demand for safe liquid assets. Because the dollar anchors, global finance stress funnels activity toward it rather than away. Even countries targeted by sanctions often maintain dollar exposure indirectly through partners, intermediaries, or offshore markets. This does not imply approval, it reflects necessity. Energy markets illustrate this clearly because pricing benchmarks, insurance, and shipping remain dollar-based even when buyers and sellers dislike the system. Attempts to reprice trade require parallel infrastructure, legal acceptance, and deep hedging markets, which take years to build. During crises, there is no patience for experimentation. Governments choose continuity to protect employment savings and stability. As tensions rise, central banks increase reserves, not reduce them. This behavior appears contradictory until incentives are examined. Financial survival outweighs political signaling. Over time, repeated shocks entrench habits, creating a cycle where fear reinforces dependence. The more volatile the world becomes, the more valuable coordination appears. This is why predictions of rapid collapse keep failing. Change arrives slowly through boring adjustments rather than dramatic breaks. Geopolitics accelerates caution, not revolution. The dollar benefits from being the default in a fragmented world. Fragmentation raises the premium on common standards. Until rivals can offer shared rules, scale and enforcement fragmentation will continue feeding the same system. Understanding this dynamic explains why headlines promising imminent replacement fade quickly. The system endures by absorbing shocks and redistributing them through familiar channels, keeping its core intact while the world churns around it. This persistence reshapes planning horizons for governments, investors, firms, and households worldwide, embedding caution into decisions across generations everywhere today. Volatility does not weaken the center, it quietly fortifies it. Another reason the dollar system persists is that global institutions are structurally designed around it, rather than neutral alternatives. International trade law, financial reporting standards, commodity exchanges, and risk models all assume dollar benchmarks by default. Contracts reference dollar pricing. Dispute resolution often relies on jurisdictions comfortable with dollar settlements, and accounting systems prioritize dollar-denominated clarity. This creates an invisible bias where choosing the dollar is easier, cheaper, and legally safer than choosing something else. Over time, professionals, lawyers, bankers, insurers, and regulators are trained within this framework, reinforcing it through expertise. Institutional habits matter because systems follow what people understand best. Changing currencies would require retraining, rewriting standards, and redesigning compliance across thousands of interconnected entities. That cost is rarely discussed publicly, but it is enormous. Even countries seeking diversification find their own institutions resistant to change because stability protects careers and reduces uncertainty. Multilateral organizations also operate within this logic because neutrality does not mean detachment from dominant systems. They rely on funding markets, liquidity, and enforcement mechanisms that already exist. This locks governance into existing structures. As a result, reform debates focus on marginal adjustments rather than foundational redesign. Path dependence becomes institutional memory. What started as a post-war convenience became embedded bureaucracy. Once embedded, it shapes outcomes regardless of political will. This explains why conferences, declarations, and agreements often sound ambitious yet produce limited practical shifts. The architecture remains intact beneath the rhetoric. The dollar benefits not from constant defense but from default alignment. Alignment reduces friction, and friction avoidance drives behavior. Over decades, this preference compounds quietly. People defend what works, even if it is imperfect. Institutions move slowly because stability is their purpose. Understanding this layer reveals why change requires more than economic logic. It requires institutional transformation. Until that happens, the system continues reproducing itself through rules, norms, and professional incentives worldwide. The real power lies not in currency choice, but in the rules that make choice costly. Public debate often frames the dollar system as something imposed from above, but its endurance also depends on everyday private decisions made by firms, investors, and consumers. Companies choose invoicing currencies based on what minimizes risk, not ideology. Workers accept salaries, savings, and pensions tied indirectly to dollar assets because stability matters more than symbolism. Asset managers prioritize liquidity to meet obligations on time. Insurance firms price exposure using dollar benchmarks because historical data exists there. Each small decision reinforces the same center without coordination. This bottom-up reinforcement is powerful because it is voluntary and dispersed. No single actor controls it, yet everyone contributes to it. Behavioral economics explains this through loss aversion. People fear downside more than they value potential upside. Moving away from the dollar introduces unknown risks, while staying offers predictable outcomes. That asymmetry keeps behavior anchored. Even when returns elsewhere appear attractive, uncertainty slows movement. Over time, familiarity becomes confidence. Confidence becomes habit. Habit becomes structure. This explains why reforms struggle, even when logically sound. Systems persist when millions of micro-decisions align around safety. Political leaders cannot easily override that without triggering backlash from markets, households, and institutions simultaneously. This is why monetary revolutions are rare and often follow collapse, not planning. The dollar trap therefore reflects human behavior as much as policy design. People coordinate unconsciously around what feels safe. Breaking that coordination would require a credible alternative that feels equally boring, reliable, and predictable. Radical change sounds exciting, but finance rewards dull consistency. The dollar excels at being boring. It does not promise perfection, it promises continuity. That promise carries enormous weight in complex systems. Until another currency can match that emotional and practical reassurance, diversification will remain cautious, incremental, and limited. Understanding this behavioral layer shows why dominance persists, even without formal enforcement. The system runs on shared expectations, not commands. Those expectations are slow to change because trust accumulates through time, not announcements. As long as risk avoidance dominates decision-making, the dollar remains the anchor around which global behavior quietly organizes itself. The strongest lock is not policy or power, but collective comfort with the familiar. Looking forward, the question is not whether the dollar will disappear suddenly, but whether its dominance will slowly erode under new pressures. Economic history suggests transitions happen gradually through layering rather than replacement. Countries may increase trade in local currencies, expand bilateral payment systems, or diversify reserves at the margins while keeping the dollar at the core. This creates a more multipolar surface without dismantling the foundation. Such shifts reduce vulnerability slightly, but do not remove dependence. The dollar remains the reference point even when alternatives grow. This incremental change reflects realism rather than failure. Governments balance resilience with stability, choosing adaptation over rupture. A full exit would require not only economic alignment, but political trust among major powers, something currently in short supply. Fragmented geopolitics makes shared monetary leadership harder, not easier. Ironically, rivalry reinforces the need for a neutral standard everyone already uses. Until global governance improves, fragmentation favors incumbents. The dollar benefits from being the least controversial option in a divided world. That does not mean it is loved, it means it is tolerated. Tolerance is enough for systems built on coordination. Over time, pressures may reshape how dominance looks, reducing exclusivity, but not centrality. The system bends rather than breaks. For individuals and businesses, this means volatility will coexist with continuity. Headlines will promise change while daily transactions remain familiar. Understanding this dynamic prevents false expectations. The dollar trap is not a single lock, but many overlapping incentives, histories, institutions, and behaviors. Removing one does not free the system. Change would require simultaneous shifts across trade, debt, law, technology, and trust. That scale of coordination has no historical precedent without crisis. Until such a moment emerges, the world continues operating inside the same architecture, adjusting its edges while preserving its core. This reality does not imply permanence, but it does imply patience. Monetary power fades slowly, not dramatically. The dollar remains central because it still solves more problems than it creates for most participants. As long as that balance holds, the trap remains intact, shaping global finance quietly and persistently. The real question is not who replaces the dollar, but what kind of crisis would force the world to try. One often overlooked aspect of the dollar trap is how it shapes domestic policy choices inside countries that depend on it. Governments managing inflation, employment, and growth must constantly consider how markets will interpret their actions through a dollar lens. Interest rate decisions, fiscal spending, and capital controls are judged against global dollar conditions rather than purely domestic needs. If policies diverge too far from what dollar markets expect, currencies weaken, borrowing costs rise, and political pressure follows. This external constraint quietly limits sovereignty, even without formal rules. Policymakers learn to anticipate reactions and self-correct before penalties appear. Over time, this produces convergence, where many countries adopt similar frameworks, regardless of local context. Monetary independence becomes theoretical rather than practical. This is not unique to weaker states. Large economies feel it too, because integration amplifies exposure. When the US Federal Reserve tightens or loosens policy, ripple effects spread worldwide, forcing adjustments elsewhere. Domestic debates then react to external signals, creating feedback loops. This dynamic explains why global cycles feel synchronized even across very different economies. The dollar acts as a metronome, setting tempo whether participants like it or not. Breaking free would require insulation mechanisms that most countries lack or cannot afford. Capital controls reduce exposure but limit growth. Autarky reduces vulnerability but sacrifices efficiency. Most choose partial exposure and manage the consequences. This trade-off becomes normalized over decades. Citizens experience outcomes without seeing the structure behind them. Elections change leaders, but constraints remain. Understanding this layer shows why frustration grows despite political turnover. The system shapes policy space long before voters engage. The dollar trap therefore operates upstream, influencing choices before outcomes materialize. It narrows the range of acceptable options quietly. As long as global finance remains integrated, this pressure persists. Countries can adjust margins, but not the core rhythm. The dollar's influence becomes ambient, shaping expectations, budgets, reforms, and debates without constant visibility. This invisibility makes the system harder to challenge because it feels natural rather than imposed. When control feels invisible, resistance rarely organizes until limits are suddenly hit. Another reason the dollar trap endures is that attempts to weaken it often produce unintended consequences that reinforce the system instead. When countries reduce dollar exposure too quickly, markets interpret the move as risk rather than reform. Capital outflows accelerate, currencies weaken, and borrowing costs rise, creating domestic pressure to reverse course. What was intended as independence is perceived as instability. This reaction teaches policymakers a clear lesson that pace matters more than intent. Gradualism becomes survival strategy. Even diversification efforts are carefully signaled to avoid alarming investors. This sensitivity reveals how deeply expectations are embedded. Financial systems are forward-looking and punish uncertainty faster than they reward innovation. Because the dollar anchors expectations, deviation becomes a signal rather than a neutral adjustment. Over time, this creates a chilling effect where experimentation is limited to safe margins. States may talk about alternatives but act conservatively in practice. Meanwhile, the dollar system continues evolving, absorbing criticism without structural loss. It adapts through new instruments, regulations, and liquidity tools that address weaknesses while preserving dominance. This adaptive capacity is often underestimated. The system does not remain static. It responds to pressure selectively. That flexibility increases resilience. Critics expect collapse, but systems usually change shape instead. The dollar trap survives because it is not rigid, it is elastic. It stretches under stress, then returns to form. This elasticity comes from scale diversity and institutional memory. No rival system currently matches that combination. As a result, even efforts meant to undermine dominance become part of its evolution. The trap tightens not by force but by absorbing challenges. Understanding this dynamic reframes the debate. The question shifts from replacement to adaptation. As long as the dollar can adjust faster than alternatives can coordinate, it remains central. Power persists when systems learn faster than their challengers. That learning is ongoing, continuous, and largely invisible to the public. This is why the system feels permanent, even though history suggests nothing is. It lasts not because it is flawless, but because it is responsive. Systems rarely collapse from attack. They erode only when adaptation finally fails. When all these layers are viewed together, the dollar trap looks less like a conspiracy and more like an outcome of accumulated choices that became self-reinforcing over time. History gave the dollar an early advantage. Institutions standardized around it. Markets deepened trust habits, formed, and behavior adjusted accordingly. Each layer, trade, debt law, technology, psychology, and policy, stacked on the previous one until exit became impractical for most participants. This does not mean the system is morally right or economically optimal. It means it is coordinated. Coordination is powerful because it reduces uncertainty in a complex world. Most actors prioritize predictability over fairness, especially when stakes are high. The dollar offers a known framework where risks are understood even if imperfect. Alternatives promise autonomy but introduce ambiguity. In global finance, ambiguity is expensive. That cost shapes decisions more than ideology. The result is a system that persists without constant enforcement. It runs because everyone expects everyone else to keep using it. That expectation becomes reality. Breaking the trap would require a rare alignment of trust-scale governance and willingness to absorb short-term pain for long-term gain. Such alignment usually emerges only after severe disruption. Until then, adjustments remain incremental. The dollar may share space more than before, but it remains the reference point. This understanding shifts how we interpret headlines. De-dollarization is not a switch, it is a spectrum. Movement happens at the edges, not the center. Recognizing this prevents false hopes and exaggerated fears. It also clarifies responsibility. The system persists because it still works well enough for enough people. Change will come not from declarations, but from shifts in incentives. When the costs of staying exceed the costs of leaving, behavior will change. Until that balance flips, the trap holds. The dollar remains central not because the world cannot imagine alternatives, but because coordinating around one still solves more problems than it creates. That balance defines the present era of global finance and explains why dependence continues quietly shaping outcomes every day across borders, markets, and societies. If this perspective helped you see the system more clearly, stay connected. More breakdowns like this are coming.